I was educated at a school called Lancing College. It's on the south coast of England. I went on to study at the University of Manchester, where I received a BSc honours with honours in anatomical science. Far cry from finance. In the UK, we don't get the luxury of picking a specific subject, a multitude of subjects. We go on and specialise in a single subject. I guess I was hedging my bets and learning my finance trade. There was mathematics involved, but equally the kind of literary side, and I thought it would be well positioning for going on to a multitude of jobs. I've got a very competitive nature. I was looking around for a job where I could, get a little bit of adrenaline and be excited about my day-to-day, be challenged, take on some risk, and I quickly fell into banking shortly after university. I initially found myself actually at Morgan Stanley, where I worked on in the corporate treasury function. I then went on to BNP Paribas, where I led a sales team, specifically the interest rate interbank desk. This desk specialises in absorbing much of the risk from the street, from many of the banks in Europe and the UK. They would come to BNP to get a risk transfer price for much of their interest rate risk. I left BNP Paribas. It was a great place, surrounded by some awesome mathematicians. But I left and went on to run a similar team, interbank sales at Goldman Sachs. And I really had my eyes opened. It was a phenomenal place, truly entrepreneurial. A really great founding place for learning finance and helping others. I guess a bit like my transition from anatomical science into banking, I haven't taken a traditional route. The trading environment is a very entrepreneurial place. You're always looking for opportunities, you're always looking for new markets, new ways to try and derive some economics for the firm. But during my time at Goldman Sachs and prior to that at BNP Paribas, I'd invested in a number of small businesses myself. And that was really the start of a journey for me. As I invested in more and more businesses, I started to kind of get a common thread of what was a missing piece, and ultimately that was funding. And I really got the bug, and I decided therefore to jump ship from Goldman Sachs and set up Capitalisecom. Sure, so Capitalisecom was really the coming together of a number of ideas. Firstly, it was through the investments in the businesses that I'd made. Each of them had approached me to help them raise funding, debt finance at some point, and it really did sort of overwhelm me at how difficult it was for myself, who had a good financial background, to help these businesses, and how difficult it was to access that finance despite my background. But at the same time, I was also lending money on alternative finance platforms. And the capacity utilisation of my cash was actually always running at about 50 or 60%. So it struck me that there was an oversupply of credit. There was a lot of money trying to get into this alternative finance space, and yet they couldn't find the transactions to actually get the money out. So I started to see this opportunity to bring an origination function of deal flow to the myriad lenders that are around. Capitalise.com is not a lender itself. It functions as a platform. There are over 55 lenders on our platform. They are all institutional, raising from the high street, so Barclays, Lloyds, Santander. We have many of the sort of unicorn type alternative finance like Funding Circle, Market Invoice, and a whole bunch of other exciting new lending financial brands that have come to the market. But actually part of what I'm most excited about is the independent lending community. These are more traditional lenders that many people don't know. They don't necessarily have the budgets to go out and find the businesses to lend to. But some of these guys are so well set up to fund the business. They just need that origination and that access. And so that's really what Capitalise.com does. So specifically for an SME, what we try to do is understand what the hooks are in their business. In essence, we need some kind of security, some vehicle with which we can fund. And through our website, we ultimately provide a mechanism whereby we can filter out which are the most appropriate lenders and make a firm introduction. It doesn't matter what economy we talk about. It can be an emerging economy, it can be a developed economy, and it can be right here in my market here in the UK. SMEs are the absolute lifeblood of every single economy. They represent the majority of all recruitment in any single economy. Many of them are small businesses, many of them are thriving. But here in the UK, and pulling it back into funding, there are about 5 million SMEs. About 50% of those are termed permanent non-borrowers, but the other 50% at some point have either borrowed or at some point in the future will go on to borrow. And debt is a very powerful tool. It needs to be taken in the context of both risk and reward, and a business needs to understand the leverage that they're undertaking. In terms of raising finance, and this doesn't just apply to Capitalise.com, an SME really needs to understand its cash flow position, and it needs to sort of plan ahead and understand what the cash flow limitations are going to be. Quite often, the finance function in an SME is often an afterthought. It's sort of done at the end of the month. Accounts are pulled up, invoices are sent. If an SME can get itself into a position whereby it can start to understand the forward cash flows and start to understand where the sweet spots, the good times are going to be, but equally where the bad times are going to be, it can really position itself for getting funding from the 200 odd lenders that are here in the UK, but equally elsewhere in the world. In terms of Capitalise.com, what we do is we try to make it as simple as possible. We've got a number of logic gate questions that try to simplify the journey for funding. So, do you have a cash machine? Do you invoice businesses? Do you have purchase orders, and therefore we can go on and raise trade finance? So we try to narrow down your options as fast as possible. There's a natural trade-off in the digital world between people's attention and the amount of information they're willing to put into a form and what they expect out on the other side. We would obviously like to ask more questions to have a higher confidence and a higher probability of getting you the right answer, but we have to marry that up with the attention of the SMEs. The thing about finance is, and I'll give you some SME statistics to begin with. The reality is that lending in the UK is actually not limited by the supply of credit. And nor is it limited by the demand. There really is a natural demand and a natural supply. It is really about matchmaking with that supply and demand. But the real limiting factor is actually around SME behaviour. So typically, an SME leaves just 7 days to source the credit that they actually need. Then, after giving themselves a pretty short window, they spend less than 1 hour researching. Now, given that there are about 200 lenders in the SME market, those two things on their own starts to limit their access. But actually, the most important part is that 71% of them actually apply to only one lender. So when you take those three statistics together, you actually start to get to a place where it's a very natural place for them to go to their bank manager. And the big four, the big five, ultimately command over 80% of all SME relationships. And the banks have got enormous balance sheets and they have cash to lend. But you've got to be a very specific SME to receive that funding. You've got to have more than 2 years of filed accounts. You've got to have very solid affordability, and they're not necessarily looking creatively at the hooks with which they could lend. So, to answer your question, how do SMEs access this enormous array of lenders? So there are nearly 10% of UK SMEs that are aware that alternative finance exists, but there are 100 alternative lenders. And And in those lenders, they have a myriad of product. So it's almost, unimaginable that a business that is focusing on its business and being busy in its business will have the true understanding of where to get the best product. So, Capitalise.com or its competitors, service that function whereby they can actually go on and refine and provide the right lenders for the SMEs. I think the number one piece of advice for an SME, once they've actually got their house in order and they know that they actually want to go on and find some finance, is to understand the hooks, as it were, in their business that they can go on to actually raise finance against. And so, I mentioned earlier, if they've got invoices, they can go out and they can get invoice finance. That in itself, there are lots of lenders and there are lots of sub-products within there. So we could do subscription finance, there's contract finance, there's confidential finance. But if you understand that we could use that invoice to actually go on to do some funding, there is an infinite amount of lenders that we can go out and get you funded. Likewise, if you've got purchase orders or a cash machine, you can leverage any of those things to go on and fund your business. But the key thing beyond that is affordability and risk and reward. So you've got to be able to afford this. It is not good for Capitalise and it's not good for the lenders to ultimately be lending to a business that can't afford its interest rate payments. So you've got to understand what you can afford as a business. The first thing that a lender is going to ask for is a set of accounts. And if you're older than 1 year and you filed a single set of accounts, they want to see those audited, regulated accounts. They want to see the most up to date. If you haven't got it up to that point, then the best set of management accounts that you can get, you need to go into a lender prepared, and they're going to want to see those pieces of paper. But crucially, don't limit yourself. There can often be bad information in a business's history, but that doesn't mean that you can't get finance. You just got to be upfront about it, and particularly when you speak to an intermediary, you can save yourself a whole lot of time if you're upfront and you get out any bad history that's out there, because there really is a lender out there for most businesses, and it's just don't go down the wrong route just because you've been trying to hide things, etc. You've got to be ruthless about your margin. You've got to understand what makes your margin, your gross margin and your net margin. And you've got to cut away any unnecessary costs because they will eat away at your business. And you can start off, perhaps you're in the fashion business and you're looking at 70% margin in terms of importing, items, garments, whatever it might be. But by the time you take in, customs costs, haulage, transfers, taxes, and so on and so forth, your margin's not looking so good anymore. So you really need to understand what your margin is right at the point of that negotiating of the deal. And that leads me on to my second point. Most transactions are either a delivery of a product or a delivery of a service. And so actually, by negotiating as hard as you possibly can at the front end of that to get yourself the best deal with your suppliers, the people that you're selling to, that enables you to lock in that profit. Rarely is a profit made at the end of a transaction, it's made at the beginning when you shake hands. The advent of alternative finance really came out of the crisis and the lack of alternatives that were there, and also the advent of technology. And as technology has grown, the solutions that are available for businesses have grown with it, and that's amazing. E-commerce businesses, small e-commerce businesses, bedroom e-commerce businesses that could never have got funded before can now get funding through technological changes and the new advance of these types of lenders. And we can look at that across a wide spectrum of different types of products. But it's key. Alternative finance really is still in its infancy. Banking has been around ever since we've been buying and selling things. It's a very resilient sector, and it's not going to go away. It's not going to get beaten by alternative finance. And the movement of funds onto platforms like Funding Circle or Lending Club from institutions goes to show the direction with which this will go. So banking will continue to be the central hub, and some of these exciting products will provide a better user experience for an SME to access finance. But what I think will happen is over time, many of these businesses, particularly the unicorns, will ultimately be funded by institutions that provide a superior user experience in terms of providing capital to SMEs. I think, in terms of an SME being on the other end of either a bank and alternative finance or wherever it is that they receive it, independent, there is room for multiple lenders and multiple relationships within an SME. I was sitting at a trade conference on a panel on Monday, and to my left I had Virgin Startup, and to my right I had Crowdcube, so an equity crowdsourcing. And somebody was asking, which of the three of you would we actually pick to work with? And we all gave our merits. Virgin Startup are there for the young businesses, less than 2 years, £25,000 for per director per business. They want to get entrepreneurs on the road. Crowdcube are talking from an equity perspective, and I'm picking up probably from the Virgin journey. But actually, all three of us could sit next to each other. We could raise some relatively cheap funding from Virgin. We could put in some more senior type debt from the various lenders that sit on our platform. But equally, there's room for an equity round from a crowd equity platform as well. Accessing finance on Capitalisecom is really simple. There are a number of ways with which you can enter your information. There's a very quick questionnaire. It takes as little as I can get through it in probably 2 minutes. For somebody who's on it for the first time, maybe 4 minutes. To get through and meet the right lenders. We've also got a number of accounting integrations. So Xero being one of them. So with a single click and authorization of your accounting data, we can slurp all of the data out and present that to you to confirm and authorize that the information is correct, and then we can make suggestions on the basis of that accounting data. What we do that's critical is we have this panel of lenders, over 50 lenders on the other side, and we have behavioural analytics in place that enable us to assess the likelihood of offer for you to receive specifically to your sector, and we represent that to you as a business. But critically, we also bring affordability to the beginning of the process, so that you can understand the cost of funds, as opposed to going through the entire transaction and only finding out at the end.